Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Opeth called Sorceress. You know, the last time I talked about Opeth on this channel got kind of complicated. And it got complicated for reasons that I find more than a little bit amusing, because as much as I like progressive rock and metal, to say nothing of the production and mixing talents of multi-instrumentalist, songwriter, and producer Steven Wilson, I found his contributions to the overall blend of it with Opeth and progressive rock to be, well, a little bit less inspiring than I liked, especially when I dug into the album's heritage and the 2014 release Pale Communion that I reviewed on this channel. Paradoxically, going back through Opeth's discography, I found records like the progressive and blackened death metal, a genre which I rarely like, of albums like Still Life, Blackwater Park, and the twin release of Deliverance and Damnation. I found them a lot more compelling. As such, while I like Pale Communion on some level, I haven't really gone back to it in the same way, especially not in comparison with Steven Wilson's amazing solo project Hand Cannot Erase last year in 2015. Just some stellar progressive rock. I mean, two great tastes don't always work together in the same genre. It happens. Steven Wilson did, after all, contribute to the more aggressive side of those early 2000s albums. Maybe they should have just stuck with that instead of going full retro prog. I mean, I know they wanted to, but the results have kind of been mixed at this point. But it seems like Opeth themselves are looking to shift things up yet again. After 4 albums with Roadrunner Records, they left that label for Nuclear Blast and their own imprint for their newest album, Sorceress, which looked to be infusing a little bit more metal back into their material. More interestingly was the fact that Steven Wilson was nowhere near the production credits of this record, which hasn't been the case for Opeth in around 15 years. And as such, the critical reviews have suggested it's one of Opeth's best albums in years too. So I wanted to ensure I gave it my full and due consideration, even if, yeah, again, this review is a little bit late. So, okay, what did we get with Sorceress? Well, honestly, I hate to say this, but Sorceress by Opeth really did not click for me whatsoever, especially in comparison with their previous albums. And I can't tell you how frustrating that is. Opeth is a band I like and respect. Still Life remains one of my favorite records, probably of all time, but I just could not get into this. Now, that's not saying there aren't songs that I like, because again, there are, and I can certainly respect the compositions and inspiration behind this album. There certainly is a lot of real complexity here, and I like a lot of the older material that inspired this album, but outside of moments and a couple songs, I'm not really sure I like this as a whole. Certainly not as much as I wanted to. And for a change, let's start off with the lyrics and themes. And look, I'm not going to make the mistake of overanalyzing this here again, especially after the rabbit hole I went down on Pale Communion, only to discover in a later interview with Michael Ackerfeld how little any of that mattered. Now, this time around, though, the language is not just more clear, but the themes are also a little bit more defined. And it's also where this album kind of started to lose me right out of the gate. See, Sorceress is a record about the darker, fouler emotions that can come up with a loving situation, then losing it. A sharp balance between beauty and ugliness that doesn't just need to come through properly in the delivery, we'll come back to that, but in a lot of the language of the album as well. And make no mistake, I really do like the descriptive language and flow of Ackerfeld's poetry, and I appreciate how it juxtaposes with the harsher subject matter, and how he frames the overarching situation with enough tact to show the protagonist's underlying depression and distrust of his own emotions, spreading the blame across both members of the couple, and showing the lingering aftermath of it all, both with longing for that connection and the acknowledgement that his own personal demons can mostly overrun his reason in situations like this. But especially early on, the sourness that comes through in the first title track in Chrysalis is accurate to the point of being a little bit hard to stomach and sympathize with, especially considering how passive-aggressive it is. Again, makes sense in context of the characters here and a lot of the framing, but throughout the album, the Greek goddess Persephone is referenced to bookend things, and really the only concrete evidence of a female perspective or counterbalance voice on this album. And assuming this places the record's protagonist as Hades, the emotional dynamic feels kinda skewed. It doesn't really coalesce. On a broad level, it kind of makes sense. Depression, descent into the underworld, never quite escaping it, that mostly works, but it also ignores that most versions of the underlying myth have Hades abduct and rape Persephone, not engage in the sort of caustic, passive-aggressive bitching that more often than not blames her. Again, the overarching framing does compensate for that a little bit, but not enough to tie the emotional dynamic of the writing together all that well, especially if we're supposed to remotely sympathize with our protagonist here. Now, part of this this ties into the delivery. Ackerfeld's singing is very measured and poised, only at rare spots on this album getting rougher or harsher, which, yeah, might occasionally work in context on the latter half of the album, a little bit more the depressing points, but can feel a little bit distancing, especially with some of the subject matter. Of course, none of this is helped by the vocal layering and production, some of which is the most slapdash I've heard in an Opeth record in some time. Not the multi-tracking per se. For the most part, Ackerfeld's layered harmonies are generally pretty, even if I'm not exactly wild about his falsetto crooning, not his best range. But the big problem is that if he's not going to cut loose and bring more real intensity here, layering him more deeply into the mix can make him seem like less of a presence on these songs. And that's before you throw in some of the vocal filters that either sound compressed or like he's trying to imitate Steven Wilson circa 1999. And this is where we have to get into the instrumentation and production. And again, as I said at the very beginning, there are moments I like on this album. Not exactly that many hooks. Air is probably the best of those, and even then that's not saying a lot. But when this record can build to a decent vibe or solo, I get into this. There's a great tonal balance on Will o' the Wisp with the acoustic guitars and flow that's later echoed a lot on A Fleeting Glance. It probably builds to one of the best guitar solos on the album. Probably one of the better songs here too, thanks to the crescendo on the back half. And yeah, I like the dueling organ and guitar work on Chrysalis, but the only thing I liked about that song. And the bluesy segments that got into Strange Brew, those were great. And I have to call it the drum work on this record. Even if there are weird moments like the compressed tone on Chrysalis around the cymbals, for the most part, these drum lines are absolutely excellent here. Progressive and dynamic in a way that I really wish was echoed across the rest of this album. And this is where we get to the first of two big issues with this record. The first being that Opeth really aren't innovating the same way they have in the past, and their callbacks to certain rock acts are all the more blatant. Will o' the Wisp and the first half of A Fleeting Glance sound like something that Steven Wilson would have made around the turn of the millennium. That's where we get songs that crib generously from mid-70s Deep Purple records like Burn and Stormbringer, but minus the tightness and intensity that made those albums actually really click for me. Hate to say it, but Ackerfeld is not David Coverdale, and that sort of absence in the vocal line shows. And that ties to the other major issue of this album. In pieces, the melodies can be satisfying, but the production and arrangements are often really hit and miss. I talked about the buried vocal production, but in truth, a lot of the tones feel runny and flat, either on speakers or on headphones, with the rhythm guitar trying to hold ground against the wheedling organs, the thicker bass, and a main guitar struggling to cut through. I like a lot of the shredding, but the compositions and production are not flattering them here. Or take the strings arrangement behind the Middle Eastern-inspired scales of the Seventh Sojourn. It's a solid melody, sure, that's mirrored, but they don't have great distinctive texture, and the song runs out of momentum right after the main ascending crescendo, and that unfortunately is not uncommon. A lot of these songs often kill any sort of momentum with these very quiet, delicate, distant guitar, piano, or organ interludes that are really not transitioned well, and often feel too stiff and staccato regardless. And when we get back to the heavier segments, the riffs don't really evolve that much melodically to get all that interesting. In short, I didn't nearly enjoy Sorceress by Opeth as much as I wanted to. And again, that frustrates me because there is some significant talent here. The lyrical poetry, the musicianship, there's a lot to like, but it more often feels like a misshapen grab bag of ideas rather than cohesive and consistent songs, and not in the way that could take the album and tones that inspired this in a new direction. And when you pair that with the lyrics, well, for me it's a very light 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're a die-hard Opeth fan. And even then you might get disappointed. Otherwise, if you like progressive rock and metal, this is worth a listen. It calls back to a lot of really good records, but man, Opeth, they've done so much better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'm more than grateful. I got the poll up here, so if you guys all want to tell me I'm wrong, there's your opportunity. Although, I'm really not sure where the critics are ultimately going to lie on this album. It does have a lot of acclaim among certain critical sets, but I'm not sure the fans are quite as on board. You never know, I want to see and find out. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. My list of albums is still pretty thick right now. I'm just trying to burn my way through my backlog. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.